In the summer of 1940, Britain's fate balanced on a knife's edge as the Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of attacks, determined to crush the nation's defenses and pave the way for invasion. At the heart of this desperate struggle stood the Hawker Hurricane, a fighter that lacked the sleek glamour of the Spitfire but proved tougher, deadlier, and more forgiving in combat. Two-thirds of Fighter Command's squadrons flew Hurricanes, and their pilots bore the heavy cost of holding the line. Men like Ginger Lacy endured endless scrambles, brutal dogfights, crash landings, and the constant loss of comrades, yet time and again the Hurricane carried them home when other aircraft would have failed. The toll was severe. Squadrons wiped out, friends gone overnight, and aircraft falling in flames across English fields, but the victories were undeniable. Hurricanes accounted for the majority of German losses in the Battle of Britain, especially among bombers, and on days like September 15, 1940, they tore entire formations from the sky, forcing Hitler to abandon his invasion plans. As the war dragged on, the Hurricane adapted relentlessly, from night fighter to bomber interceptor, ground attacker, and even a frontline workhorse in Malta, the Soviet Union, Burma, and beyond. Its strengths, ruggedness, stability, and adaptability helped young pilots survive their first battles and allowed seasoned veterans to keep fighting long after fatigue and injury should have ended their service. The losses were staggering, but the benefits were decisive. Without the Hurricane, Britain might not have survived those critical first years. And without pilots like Lacy, who fought from the war's first days to its very end, the story of survival and eventual victory might have been very different. British Flight Sergeant James Ginger Lacy watched in disbelief from the cockpit of his Hawker Hurricane as a German Heinkel. He-111 had just struck Buckingham Palace. Dark smoke still rising into the air. Anger boiled up in Lacy, and his Hurricane answered with a thunderous bellow from its 130-horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin. Moments before, he had failed to catch the Heinkel before it dropped its bombs. Now he vowed it would not get away. He drove the fighter into a 340 MPH dive, unleashing all 8 77mm Browning machine guns in a hail of fire at the fleeing German formation. Lacy stuck to his target, even as return fire from the Heinkel shredded his wings, ruptured the cooling system, and splattered oil across the windscreen. His plane might not have been the quickest or most powerful aircraft over Britain, but he was about to discover why the Hurricane mattered in ways few expected. At 16, James Ginger Lacy paced the fields around Wetherby in West Yorkshire. His family farmed the land, but he felt no pull toward the soil. He would scan the far horizon and the clouds for the tiny silhouettes of passing aircraft. Every sighting sent his pulse racing. His father was adamant. Farming was their heritage and their income. The sky, he was told, belonged to birds and to boys with unrealistic dreams. Arguments flared at the kitchen table, yet Lacy would not give up his aim. His mother fretted that he might fail the RAF's strict medical exam. He was thin, pale, and wiry, but Lacy was convinced he could find his way into the air. Years later, his daughter remembered how fiercely he had wanted to join the RAF while his father insisted he become a farmer. At 18, he took up an apprenticeship as a pharmacist in Leeds, a respectable path intended to steady his grieving mother after his father's death. Privately, though, at 20, he enlisted in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in January 1937, the part-time force-trained civilian pilots who could be called up in wartime. Ideal for Lacy. Steady weekday. Work and flying training each weekend at the Yorkshire Flying School in Yaden. He learned fast, mastering navigation, aerobatics, and formation flying. By the mid-1930s, his ability was clear, and he went on to qualify as a flight instructor himself. At the same time, a different struggle was playing out inside the RAF and at Hawker's factories. Britain's air defenses were falling behind the expanding German Luftwaffe. Many squadrons still relied on biplanes unchanged since the First World War, slow, fragile, and obsolete, and senior officers hesitated to adopt newer, unproven designs. Hawker's lead designer, Sidney Cam, recognized the danger and, despite ongoing skepticism, pushed ahead with a bold new concept, a monoplane fighter. The result was sleek, advanced, and a clear break with the past. A clean aerodynamic shape, retractable landing gear, and a potent Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Christened the Hurricane, it promised speed, dependability, and simple upkeep, qualities well suited to the looming conflict. On the 6th of November 1935, Hawker's chief test pilot, Flight Lieutenant George Bullman, lifted prototype K5083 off the runway. The aircraft immediately proved itself fast, stable, and responsive. Bullman remarked that it was simple and easy to fly, an immense advantage for pilots who would need rapid wartime training. By 1938, Hurricanes were entering frontline squadrons and earning a reputation among pilots for toughness and straightforward handling. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the RAF hurriedly expanded its ranks, calling pilots to service. In early September 1939, Lacy received orders to report for active duty. At RAF Gravesend, he crossed the airfield and saw row after row of Hurricanes, their noses tilted toward the sky. He climbed into the cockpit aware, more clearly than ever, why he had rejected the farm and pursued flying. He was ready to test his skill and courage against whatever lay ahead. On 10th of May 1940, Sergeant Ginger Lacy stood by his Hurricane at Bethenaville Airfield in France, watching German bombers blot out the horizon. Training had prepared him in part, but nothing could fully ready a pilot for a sky full of enemy aircraft. His number 501 squadron had only recently arrived with young airmen and inexperienced machines. 3 days later, his first combat mission arrived without warning. Scrambled into the air with throttle open, his Hurricane strained skyward as his heart pounded. The flight climbed toward Sedan, where German forces were pressing the French lines. Near the battle, he sighted an enemy formation, swung in behind a Heinkel He-111, and opened fire. His rounds tore through a wing, sending the bomber into a burning, tumbling descent. Lacy broke away, narrowly avoiding the falling wreckage. He wasted no time closing on a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that was escorting the bombers. The German never saw him. Lacy's burst found its mark, smoke erupting as the fighter dropped toward the ground. 2 enemy aircraft were down, yet the sky remained thick with hostile planes. Gradually, Lacy began to understand the scale of what he faced. His more than 1,000 hours in the air were not just bragging rights, but a real advantage in combat. That afternoon, he was back in the air, brimming with confidence. Spying a twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf-110, he slipped into position behind it. The Hurricane's agile controls let him win the turning duel, and another accurate burst sent the enemy up in flames. His daughter later remembered that when he landed, few believed what he claimed. It had been his very first combat of World War II. In that instant, Lacy had proved himself, and his aircraft had too. Hurricanes fought relentlessly and exposed both virtues and faults. Crews praised their toughness. Small-caliber hits often caused no catastrophic failure, and field repairs could be carried out quickly in muddy strips. The Hurricane could outturn the faster Messerschmitt Bf-109s, giving pilots precious seconds to aim. Shortcomings did appear. Pilots grumbled about sluggish acceleration from the early 2-bladed wooden propellers. Rapid modifications fitted 3-bladed variable pitch propellers, which noticeably improved acceleration and climb. That vital upgrade was rushed to squadrons, sharpening their effectiveness amid the chaotic fighting across Europe. As France was collapsing, Lacy was rising as an ace. On 27 May, he shot down 2 more Heinkel He-111 bombers, making him one of the first Hurricane aces of the war. He knew the Hurricane's durability. Its stout structure had saved him more than once, but his luck would not hold. Late in May, after taking heavy fire from enemy fighters, a final shot crippled his engine and the aircraft lurched. He crash-landed hard in marshy ground, the impact stunning him as water flooded the cockpit. Battling panic, he forced the jammed canopy open and hauled himself free, barely escaping drowning before collapsing on the muddy bank as his Hurricane sank. France intended to decorate him for his bravery, but the presentation was overtaken by events when German forces reached Paris on the day the ceremony was due, and he left without the public honor. By mid-June, the situation looked desperate. France was falling and airfields were abandoned overnight. In late June 1940, Sergeant Ginger Lacy returned to England and rejoined No. 501 Squadron at Gravesend. The battered RAF had withdrawn from France and prepared for a possible invasion as Hitler's forces gathered across the Channel, leaving Britain almost alone. Lacy said he felt exhausted even before the next fighting began. His lasting memory of the Battle of Britain was relentless tiredness. Days starting before dawn. Pilots sleeping fitfully in requisitioned houses near the airfield, always alert for the sudden ring of the telephone or the shout to scramble. He described the ritual, a quick tea and breakfast, a short walk to the aircraft to check them over, fitting parachutes and helmets and draping them over the control column, doing what they could to be ready for the call that rarely delayed. Enemy pressure grew day by day, and hurricanes were launched again and again to try to stop waves of German bombers. The hurricane lacked glamour. Public adoration favored the sleek, photogenic Spitfire. But for fighter command, the sturdy Hurricane bore the weight of the fight, easier to repair and more forgiving to fly. Nearly two-thirds of Britain's frontline fighter units flew Hurricanes. Airmen valued the type for its toughness. Crews walked away from dogfights and forced landings that would have been fatal in weaker planes. Lacy himself escaped several emergency landings in badly damaged Hurricanes. The routine became grueling, dangerous, and relentless. Forced landings were an accepted risk. Pilots learned to harden themselves and to treat opponents as nothing more than aircraft in the sky. Lacy used the RAF's term bandits for hostile or unidentified planes. The combat turned clinical. You fired at any aircraft with the wrong markings in British airspace because you had been ordered to remove it. By September 1940, German bombers were striking British towns every day. London smoldered, civilians hid in shelters, and RAF crews flew under constant strain. From Gravesend, Lacy scrambled repeatedly to intercept enemy formations, and often found himself facing large numbers on his own. On 13th of September, he climbed rapidly to intercept a formation of Heinkel. He wanted a lens assaulting central London and arrived as one had just released its bombs over Buckingham Palace. Diving into the mass, he closed in despite incoming fire. His Hurricane took hits while he sent short bursts into a nearby Heinkel, which began to burn and tumble earthward. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit and cut his shoulder. The engine coughed and the controls stiffened. Yet he managed to coax the crippled fighter back toward Gravesend and, with fuel and height critically low, made a hard landing near the field, escaping with only minor additional injuries. As crews adapted, the Hurricane was improved. Early sluggishness was cured by higher octane fuel and three-bladed constant-speed propellers, which noticeably boosted climb and acceleration. The firepower was upgraded too. Hurricanes carried 8 Browning 303 machine guns, packing concentrated punch that was especially deadly against the slower German bombers. A few seconds of accurate shooting could send one down. But German fighters were advancing as well, and losses piled up. In Lacy's squadron, 17 men were lost in a matter of months during the Battle of Britain. Pilots rotated constantly and were replaced by inexperienced recruits. The emotional toll was heavy. He recalled bunks once filled with 4 sergeants reduced until he was the only original occupant left, a thought that made him wonder how soon another man would take his place. Yet there was no time to grieve. Every dawn he strapped into his Hurricane and went back out to fight. On the morning of 15th of September 1940, nearly 1,000 German aircraft darkened southern England's skies. Hitler had chosen the day to attempt a decisive blow. If the Luftwaffe broke fighter command, invasion would likely follow. At Gravesend, the tension was palpable as pilots and ground crews waited. When the telephone finally rang, the scramble order went out. Lacy ran to his Hurricane. Engines coughed to life and the squadron roared aloft. Climbing hard, he soon sighted waves of Heinkels and Dorniers, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109s. He picked out a Dornier Do-17 on the formation's rim and fired short, controlled bursts as tracers streaked by. Bullets hammered his wings and cockpit frame, but he held the attack until the Dornier's engine burst into flames and it fell away. He banked to avoid a passing hurricane, and then a Bf-109 suddenly cut across his path. Hurricanes furnished nearly two-thirds of Britain's frontline fighter squadrons, a proportion that made them the backbone of fighter command during its darkest hours. Pilots came to trust the type for its durability. Where more delicate aircraft would have broken apart, hurricanes often absorbed punishing hits and still brought their crews home. Lacy survived several forced landings and very nearly fatal encounters simply because the airframe kept holding together long enough for him to find a way out. The daily grind of combat-hardened airmen. Sorties became a steady procession of danger, exhaustion, and mechanical improvisation. Crews grew used to the idea that a rough landing might be the outcome of any mission. Emotion was a liability pilots could not afford, so they learned to depersonalize the enemy, a fast-moving target to be engaged and eliminated rather than a human being. Lacy adopted the RAF's shorthand, calling unknown hostile aircraft bandits, and the work of killing became direct and businesslike. An aircraft with enemy markings over British skies had to be dealt with, and that was that. By September 1940, the Luftwaffe's raids had become almost routine. Cities were hammered day after day. London was frequently ablaze, and civilians drifted into subway stations and makeshift shelters to wait out the night. At Gravesend and other bases, pilots operated under constant strain. Sleep was fragmentary, and each morning brought the same ritual of hurried checks and anxious waiting for orders. Lacy found himself scrambling repeatedly to intercept incoming formations, often facing vastly superior numbers and the kinds of encounters that separated the lucky from the dead. On 13th of September, Lacy launched to intercept a force of Heinkel. He 111s over central London and arrived as one bomber had just dropped its load on Buckingham Palace. Diving through flak and tracer, he pressed home an attack that set a Heinkel alight, only to suffer severe damage in return. Shrapnel tore into his cockpit, cutting his shoulder. His engine began to fail, and controls stiffened. With altitude and fuel dwindling, he fought the crippled hurricane back toward base and managed a hard landing near the field, escaping further harm by a narrow margin. That kind of close call was becoming a pattern, a reminder that the line between survival and disaster was paper-thin. The hurricane itself changed in response to the crucible of combat. Early issues with sluggish takeoff and poor climb, caused by two-bladed wooden propellers and conservative engine tune, were tackled through the rapid introduction of higher-octane fuels and three-bladed constant-speed propellers. These modifications yielded a marked improvement in acceleration and rate of climb, giving pilots a better chance to engage or evade as situations demanded. The armament was also upgraded. Hurricanes eventually carried 8 Browning 303 machine guns arrayed to deliver concentrated bursts of lead that could bring down the lumbering German bombers in short order. Against a slow-moving Heinkel or Dornier, a few well-aimed seconds of fire could be decisive. Despite these gains, the enemy was not standing still. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s and other fighters grew deadlier and tactics evolved. The cost was steep. Within Lacy's own unit, the casualty list mounted quickly. 17 men lost in a matter of months during the Battle of Britain, and fresh, often inexperienced replacements were rotated in relentlessly. The psychological toll pressed on everyone. Bunks that had once held a small group of originals thinned out as new faces took their places, and Lacy would sometimes find himself the last of his original cohort left in the room, a thought that haunted each pre-dawn scramble. There was no time for mourning. Duty demanded immediate return to the sky. On 15th of September 1940, later celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, nearly 1,000 German aircraft darkened the skies over southern England in the Luftwaffe's bid to crush fighter command and open the way for invasion. At Gravesend, the scramble sounded and pilots hurled themselves into the air. Lacy climbed hard, picked a Dornier Do 17 out on the flank of the formation and taking tracers as he closed, put it into flames. He then found himself attacked by a Bf-109. After evasive moves, his own Hurricane was fatally hit, and he was forced to bail out, landing heavily near Maidstone while watching his burning aircraft become another smudge on the ground. Undeterred, he found another Hurricane by afternoon and returned to combat. ultimately credited with 4 enemy aircraft destroyed that day. A testament to both his resilience and the relentless tempo of wartime flying. Lacy's approach to air combat differed from some of the more glamorous aces who chased dogfights and Spitfires. He preferred to hunt the bombers that threatened cities and the population below, a role the Hurricane was designed to perform. Its steady handling, rugged construction, and ease of repair made it especially useful for these missions. Ground crews could patch and return Hurricanes to service quickly, often working in sodden fields and under fire. And relatively inexperienced pilots found the machine forgiving enough to learn quickly. During the Battle of Britain, Hurricanes accounted for over 60% of the Luftwaffe losses, most of them bombers, and their contribution was decisive even if the public adoration often favored the more elegant Spitfire. When the Luftwaffe changed course to night attacks in the autumn of 1940, the Hurricane adapted once again. Some were fitted with airborne interception radar and assigned to night fighting duties, while tactics evolved to match the new threat. Pilots learned to work with ground-controlled radar vectors, intercepting raiding bombers under blackout skies. Armament was modified, too. Many Hawker fighters received Hispano 20mm cannons that delivered far more destructive force than machine guns, especially against slow-moving bombers caught in searchlights. The Hurricane's forgiving flight characteristics reduced pilot workload during the disorienting conditions of night operations, making it practical to train crews quickly for the round-the-clock defense that Britain now needed. The aircraft's usefulness extended well beyond home. In Malta, Hurricanes were central to the island's desperate air defense campaigns. As part of Lend-Lease and other agreements, nearly 3,000 Hurricanes were dispatched to the Soviet Union, where at first they were regarded warily as second-choice equipment. Soviet pilots quickly learned to value them for their toughness, ease of maintenance in primitive conditions, and reliable performance in bitter winters. Tropicalized versions, fitted with dust filters and strengthened components, proved their worth in the Far East, where they flew missions in Burma and Singapore in punishing heat, monsoon downpours, and filthy air. Whether intercepting bombers, strafing ground targets, or conducting reconnaissance, the Hurricane proved a remarkably adaptable platform across varied climates and combat demands. Ginger Lacy's own career followed the plane's global arc. After intensive service over Europe, he was reassigned to India in early 1943, promoted to flight lieutenant, and put to work training pilots for the Burma campaign. The jungle war presented new problems: oppressive humidity, dense terrain, and an enemy who fought differently. But Lacy translated his hard-learned European lessons into effective instruction. He drilled recruits in formation discipline, taught the timing and geometry of deflection shooting, and impressed on them the need for accuracy and cool-headed execution. His classroom was practical and uncompromising. Sentiment would not save them. Skill would. Lacy later took command of No. 17 Squadron and led operations against the Japanese Army Air Force. On 19th of February 1945, operating near the Burmese frontier, he engaged nimble Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters and in a swift burst of cannon fire destroyed an enemy aircraft that tumbled into the canopy below. His 28th and last confirmed victory, achieved with only 9 20mm rounds. Surviving to fight in both the war's opening and closing chapters was rare. Lacy counted himself among a small number of RAF airmen who could claim that continuity. When the war ended in August 1945 and Japan surrendered, Lacy returned to Britain physically worn, but alive. He kept flying, moving into instructional roles at flight schools around Bridlington, Yorkshire, where his deep combat experience proved invaluable to peacetime training. In 1969, he lent that expertise to the film industry, advising director Guy Hamilton on the Battle of Britain to help recreate authentic aerial sequences. Hamilton later praised him warmly for his insight and assistance. Over time, public and scholarly opinion shifted to recognize what many veterans had known all along. The Hurricane, humble and often overshadowed in publicity by the Spitfire, was the unsung workhorse of the conflict. It destroyed more enemy aircraft overall than any other British fighter in World War II, adapted to theaters from Europe to Asia, and saved countless lives through its ruggedness and versatility. For pilots like Ginger Lacy, and for the mechanics and ground crews who kept the squadrons flying, the Hurricane was not merely a machine, but a dependable ally in the grim business of survival.